Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Herbert Gintis. He is external professor at Santa Fe Institute. Professor Gintis is also author of several books, including Game Theory Evolving, The Bounds of Reason, A Cooperative Species, and Game Theory in Action, and also co-editor of Foundations of Human Sociality and Moral Sentiments and Material Interests. So basically, Dr. Gintis does a lot of work in disciplines like sociobiology, game theory, and also disciplines regarding human behavior. So, Dr. Gintis, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on the show. I should add that I do have a newest book out, which is called Individuality and Entanglement, Princeton University Press, 2016.
Okay, thank you for adding that bit of information to the introduction. Okay, so let me just ask you first, because you do work on sociobiology, and I guess that you were one of the people that really were associated with the field from its very inception, right? So what would you say was the importance of the development of this field when it comes to studying not only human behavior, but perhaps even to the behavioral sciences at large?
Yes, it's really quite simple. Standard social theory prior to the rise of sociobiology, which really started with Edward O. Wilson's book, Sociobiology, 1985. Right. Standard social theory is what Steven Pinker calls tabula rasa. That is, humans have a lot of cognitive ability, but no content. And all the content of our lives, what we think, what we believe, our capacities, are all taught to us by culture. And sociobiology says that we evolved as a species with certain predispositions to believe certain things, to act certain ways, to value certain things, and in particular, to have a morality which is consonant with our evolutionary history. So, like, what I have studied a lot is how human morality has developed over time and what it implies for social theory and social policy.
And what would you say is the relationship between sociobiology and disciplines like human behavioral ecology and evolutionary psychology? Because, they all apply evolutionary theory to a better understanding of at least the biological basis of human behavior, correct?
Yes, they're all alternative views into a common reality. They're all sociobiology, whatever you call it. Now, you can go through the history of the word sociobiology was so threatening to traditional social theorists that it became a bad word, and they had to change it. And they started calling it something else, like, behavioral ecology, this and that. But it's sociobiology, and there's nothing dangerous about it. Human beings are a species, and we have certain characteristic species behaviors all over the world. So these are just alternative formulations. In economics, they call differentiating your product. And they have different theories a little bit, and we test them just like in physics or chemistry or whatever. There are a bunch of theories out there, and we test which ones are right and which ones are wrong. But they're all sociobiology. Sociobiology is the study of human behavior informed by the fact that we have evolved as a species to have certain predispositions and capacities.
Okay, so in your work you talk a lot about trying to create a framework for the unification of the behavioral sciences from the ones that lead with genetic and cultural evolution to the ones that deal with decision theory and game theory.
Right.
And so, I mean, we have all of these different approaches from the psychological to the sociological to the anthropological and economic. So what would you say would be the best approach to try to unifying all of these different disciplines and approaches to human behavior?
Well, the first thing to recognize is that if you have a problem, you follow that problem where it takes you. You don't confine yourself to this discipline or that discipline. Mm-hmm. Now, if you don't know a discipline, but you think it's important, you have to learn it. It's very simple. The idea that an economist shouldn't know anything about biology is like 19th century junk. It's just not true. Especially these days, with the internet, one can learn a new subject in 3 years if one has the math background and the methodological background. So what you have to do is create a generation of scientists, behavioral scientists, who are familiar with all of the basic sciences. Now, the real problem is, and this is what I faced maybe 15, 20 years ago when I started working on this, is that it's not just that these different disciplines are different, it's they contradict each other. If this happened in the physical sciences, we would be scandalized if chemists said, well, we don't believe in physics. Physics is crap. We have our own theory of chemistry. It's just, or same thing as molecular biology. They all fit together. Now, let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. Economics, for many, many years, forever, argued that humans are rational and they're selfish. Mm-hmm. Sociologists argued for many years that they are governed by norms and they're not selfish and they're not rational. And psychologists love to say how irrational human beings are. There's a famous statement, people aren't logical, they're psychological. So what I have tried to do is just simply say this is a scandalous situation, it's unscientific, you can't have multiple disciplines saying different things unless they try to adjudicate it and work out their differences, which of course has not happened. I must say the number of people who are working in the field of unification are two, as far as I know, Edward O. Wilson and Herbert Gintis. And I deeply lament that fact. I've had a lot of trouble with my most recent book because it covers in depth such things as general equilibrium theory in economics, which is a dynamical theory of social organization, sociology, Parsonian sociology, population biology in detail, that is mathematical detail, and political theory coming from game theory. I can't even get anybody to review my book because nobody knows all these topics. And yet they fit together so beautifully that it makes me want to cry almost, how beautifully they can fit together. So I think the real problem is not scientific, it's not intellectual, it is sociological. We have disciplines, and the disciplines are like medieval fiefdoms. Nobody cares what happens outside your discipline because it doesn't affect your job, it doesn't affect your publication. So it's a sociological mess in the behavioral sciences. And that's the real problem. But it has to get done because all of the really interesting stuff that's happening in the behavioral sciences is in the interstices between the disciplines. This, by the way, is also true in medicine. There are the interstices between the sociology of medicine, spreading of viruses, etc., and the epidemiology. So at any rate, that's my take on this. And I do try at least a little bit to bring these things together and show how correct sociology and correct economics are beautifully fit together. It's amazing. And also, if you add in behavioral biology, that is population biology, you get really beautiful results when you put them together. So I'm very pleased with the progress in this. But it's still so difficult. For instance, in the United States, if you apply for a grant for a behavioral science like psychology or anthropology or economics, it goes to the NSF, National Science Foundation, and they shunt it off to one discipline or another. And if your work is in between disciplines, you can't get funded because they don't have nobody to send it to. And they don't like this. The project directors at NSF, they do not like this, but that's how they're organized. So we need a reorganization of the behavioral sciences around asking questions, not around traditional disciplines. Traditional disciplines, they're almost laughable when you look from above and see how they all interact.
Right. And would you say that perhaps another one of the big problems that we have here in trying to unify all of the behavioral sciences is that perhaps there are some of them that focus on one level of analysis, in this case the individual, and others on another level of analysis that is the collective or the society?
Yes, I think that's exactly wrong. That's completely wrong. You can't talk about individuals without their social context. It doesn't mean anything. Our minds are, and I make a point of this in my book, our minds are entangled. We don't have individual minds. We have minds that are influenced by all of the people around us and all of the media. That's why people are so secure in saying, I believe X. Why do I believe X? Because everybody I know believes X. People who don't believe X are my enemies, blah, blah. The idea that you can do individual without the group or without the larger society is completely ridiculous. You can't do it. And you can't do society without individuals. I mean, there are certain social theories in which individuals play no role, like Nicholas Luhmann, but they're completely wrong. You have to look at both directions. You have causality from the social to the individual, and causality from the individual to the social, and you can't separate them out. It's ridiculous. It's like saying, well, I'm going to build a car. I'm going to have one group that makes carburetors. They don't know anything about anything else but carburetors, and another one builds gas tanks. They have nothing to do with anything else. And what you get out is a monster. There's no such thing as single levels. They're all dialectically interactive. And that's true not only for humans, for all of sociobiology, for all social species. You can't talk about the individual and the species without relating it to the social organization of the species. It doesn't mean anything.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, you can do this. You can study vision if you're a psychologist, or audition, hearing, or you can do microbiology without knowing anything about social organization at all. But if you're trying to do behavior of organisms and individuals in its social, that live in societies, you have to work on both levels, back and forth between individual and larger social structure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's always an interplay between the individual and the collective here, right? So, for example, when certain people propose that perhaps in order to understand how individuals behave in societies and also how the society at large behaves, let's say, that we have first to understand how individual brains, and particularly at the level of human cognition, work, and then through some sort of emergent processes we get societies. But I mean, is that the best approach to it or not?
No, I don't think it's the best approach at all. Mm-hmm. All of the studies go on all at the same time. Mm-hmm. You can't say first we have to understand the brain before we understand society. You just can't do that. That's like in physics. If you said, well, you have to understand quantum mechanics completely before you can understand chemistry. Well, you don't. quantum mechanics is beautiful and it's true, but you can't get chemistry out of it. It doesn't generalize the chemistry. You get certain things out of it, bands of hydrogen and this and that, but you can't just say, well, if we start off with the small and build up to the large. And you can say it's because they're emergent properties. But the idea of emergent properties just means it's too complicated for do at one level. We have to do it at a higher level and then relate it to the lower level. But the idea that you're going to discover human consciousness by just looking at brain synapses, this is not going to happen. It can't happen. And if you understand social norms, it's not even in the brain. Where is it in the brain? Where? What area of the brain gives us morality? What? None. Or we've never found any. In fact, you know how much of brain studies have told us about human behavior? Almost nothing. We still can't control most human behavior by controlling genes and their expression. Almost nothing. We can't control obesity. We can't control mental illness. Forget about it. You have to if you want to understand human behavior, you have to look at the interplay between individuals and social structure at that level. You can't do it at the level of the brain. Not I'm saying you shouldn't do brain studies. Of course you should, and maybe we'll learn a lot from them. But it's not like one is more fundamental than the other. It's not true in a social species. Social species. Hold on a second. Are you going more? Are you going? Oh, okay. In a social species, the individual is so entangled with others that you can't study individuals outside of their social. In a social species, the individual is so entangled with others that you can't study individuals outside of their social relations. I mean, you can study their digestion, you can study their cognition, you can study their visual structure, etc., but you can't study their behavior outside of their social organization.
Mm-hmm. And with that way of approaching things that you have, Dr. Gintis, what would you say is the best way for us to approach issues regarding cultural evolution and genetic evolution? Because when people refer to culture and biology, they usually tend to put them sort of at different levels or things like that. So what is the relationship there?
Well, the relationship is what we call gene-culture coevolution. Mm-hmm. Human beings, our genetic structure is a product of our cultural structure. And our cultural structure is a product of our genetic structure. Let me give you an example. I mean, everybody will agree that our cultural structure is a product of our genetic structure. Well, maybe they don't, but let me give you an example. Human speech. Now, when you study linguistics, it sounds like how it happened was humans got big brains and they got so big that they could talk. But look at the problem. Apes, the reason we can talk is because we have a musculature in our tongue. We have a breathing apparatus, the larynx, that is down in the throat that makes it possible to make the variety of sounds that we call human speech. Chimpanzees can't speak. They can make a few sounds. Why? Because they didn't develop the physiological apparatus for creating and receiving speech. Those are genetic changes, but how did they happen? They happened because individuals who could communicate better had more children. And their children inherited the vocal apparatus that allowed them to speak a little better. And over 100 or 200 or 300,000 years, you get a species that can talk a lot. And everybody has all of this vocal apparatus. You can teach chimpanzees to sign with little signs, 300-400 words even, but they can't speak because they don't have the apparatus for speaking. So our genes are a product of our culture, and not just there, all over the place. The notion that we can have a morality, human morality, is culture, isn't it? But we're the only species that has anything like morality. And it evolved out of our genetic structure. So culture comes from genes, and genes come from cultures. You can't teach an animal to be moral. You can teach an animal to behave, but that's it. The Kant was right about human morality. There's something fundamentally, irreducibly human about the idea that I did it because it was the right thing to do. That is, the genes capable of me understanding that some things are right and some things are wrong. So that's called gene-culture coevolution, and it explains why humans are the way they are. Now, it doesn't explain any other species because culture doesn't accumulate in any other species. That is, you don't have cumulative changes in culture. You have cultural behaviors, but they disappear and reappear after one or two generations, and even the highest, most advanced mammals and primates. So that's gene-culture coevolution. And to try to study one of them without the other, it's a waste of time. They're interdependent.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that it would be right for us to approach culture as another biological phenomenon and another thing that is part of our phenotype, or not?
Yeah, sure. Yes, it is. Human culture is sui generis in the sense that it's cumulative, that you can inherit it from generation to generation, and you can transform it through, again, natural selection, the natural selection of cultural universals. Sure.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to human cooperation, because I guess that for us to understand how human societies develop and particularly how we create social institutions, we really have to get at how human cooperation evolved and how it works. So what are the particularities of human cooperation that we don't really find in other species and that perhaps are a bit difficult to explain by simply resorting to, let's say, genetic evolution?
Well, genetic evolution is a big part of it. I spent a lot of my time studying what I called strong reciprocity. Right. Now, reciprocity is well known in biology. So Robert Trivers' notion of reciprocal altruism, which is not altruism at all. It's just, I help you, you help me. Now, that turns out to be less common than you think in the real world among animals. But it is there. But humans have another kind of reciprocity, which I call strong reciprocity, which is that humans have a predisposition to cooperate with others, even when there's no payoff, personal payoff, and to hurt others who do bad things, even when even when it's costly to do that. It's called retribution or vindictiveness. Humans like to hurt others who do bad things to them and to society. And they do it not because they're going to gain from it somehow, but because it feels good. It feels good to hurt someone who's hurt you. It feels good to punish someone who is behaving antisocially, even if not to you. There's no other species that I know of that behaves according to strong reciprocity. How do we know strong reciprocity exists? Through behavioral game theory. We can study it in the laboratory. We've been doing it for 30 years. You see it all over the world. We did one study, 15 small-scale societies, including hunter-gatherer societies, transhuman agriculture, foragers in Mongolia, and all of them exhibit strong reciprocity. They like to help, and they like to hurt people who hurt them. So this is part of our genes. There's no place in the world where people don't behave that way. And human cooperation is in our genes. In fact, there was just a beautiful study of 60 societies and the communality of the ethic of cooperation in those societies, with no exceptions. So if something is universal, it's certainly there's huge cultural differences between these 60 societies, but they have a common base in the predisposition to cooperate and the predisposition to punish those who don't cooperate. Mm-hmm. By the way, it's amusing to read a sociology textbook. If you look in the index of the textbook, you'll not see the word retaliation. You'll not see the word vindictive. You'll not see the word retribution. Those are considered to be pathological behaviors that you study in when you study mental illness. But they're the absolute foundation of human society. And sociologists have just not picked up this, what really is going on in human interaction. By the way, behavioral game theory, for you and your audiences, if you haven't studied it or looked at it, please go look at my book, Game Theory Evolving, or any of the others, because we go through in detail the experiments that show that people behave this way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I will be leaving links to all of your work in the description box of this interview, Dr. Gintis, for people to go and check it out. Anyway, you referred there in your answer to the phenomenon of reciprocal altruism, but what do you think about group selection? Because I guess that this is a very contentious topic in biology, and people have been discussing it for several decades, and some people change their views and things like that. And even recently in his work, Dr. E.O. Wilson also seems to accept group selection, acting also at the genetic level. I might be mistaken here, but anyway,
No, you're not mistaken. Well, I have a chapter in my most recent book, and by the way, it was first published in the Journal of Philosophy of Biology, and it's a very rigorous mathematical treatment of this issue. And my conclusion is, first of all, the idea of group selection is not just about humans. It's about all social species. All social species. And that includes, by the way, almost every sexually reproducing species, because the process of interaction between males and females concerning reproduction is a social process. You have lekking in birds. You have gift exchanges in insects. And of course in humans you have all sorts of... So social species are all over the place. And if you talk to population biologists, and I know a lot of them, and I gave a talk at Oxford, which is the heart of the critique that says there's no such thing as group selection, they're just wrong. They have this ideology, and it doesn't make any sense. You can read the chapter in my book on this. Here's the problem. They say William Hamilton, who discovered the notion of inclusive fitness, is all you need to understand social organization, because Hamilton showed that organisms will favor their kin. It's called kin selection. And the problem with that is that it's not true. And Hamilton knew it wasn't true. He changed his mind about it in his own lifetime. And he became a supporter of what's called group selection. But let me make this clear. Group selection is not selection by groups fighting with each other.
Right.
It's not the selection among groups. It's a selection for a group. That is, in certain species, the individuals do better when they congregate in certain ways and they behave in certain ways relative to each other. And that's true of humans, and it's true of corals, and it's true of wolves. It's selection for a certain social organization. And of course it goes on, and of course you can't explain it by kin selection. Kin selection only works on a single gene, or a group of genes that are additive. That is, they don't interact, they just add to each other. But if all genes just added to each other, there'd be no reason to have multicellular organisms, because the cells aren't relating to each other. The genes aren't relating to each other. So there's an ideology, and that's true in lots of fields, you know. It's true in economics that there was an ideology for a long time that, all we care about is self-interest. Now, there is no evidence for that. It's monumentally false. But it was the ideology. You couldn't get a paper published for many years unless you assume that people are selfish. Now that has changed in economics. It has not changed yet in population biology, and part of the reason is that even though you can prove that Dawkins, who was the real origin of the idea that genes are all selfish, what I argue in that book is yes, genes are utterly selfish. Every gene is utterly selfish. But that does not mean that explains how you get social organization or even an individual organization. It's an emergent property that the genes cooperate with each other because, of course, in Darwinian evolution, if you have a gene that is a maverick and doesn't cooperate, the organism that harbors that gene is likely to disappear. So it's on a larger level of evolution that you get cooperation among genes. So I don't think there's no question about that what you call group selection or multi-level selection is true, but it's not really an issue because it's the problem is that social organization is the product of Darwinian evolution, and that's all there is to it, and that's what we mean by group selection. That is that Darwinian evolution selects for groups with particular social organizations in wolves, in chimpanzees, in humans, and even in insects. The question is, how does it work? Well, we don't know a lot about how it works. There's a lot of mystery in how that happens exactly, but that's what people have to be studying.
Mm-hmm. And since you refer to Dawkins' work and to the selfish gene, would you say that perhaps one of the big obstacles between people who do research in evolution and evolutionary theory and their accepting group selection would be the fact that they are too focused on the gene as the unit of selection?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a good analogy in physics between quantum mechanics and chemistry. All of chemistry is based on quantum mechanics. Everyone believes that. But we can't solve the equations in quantum mechanics, and we have a separate field called chemistry that uses totally higher level concepts to explain chemical organization and reactions. It doesn't say quantum mechanics is wrong. It's right. In fact, people have gotten Nobel Prizes. Linus Pauling got a Nobel Prize for applying quantum mechanics to chemistry. But chemistry doesn't reduce to quantum mechanics. And similarly, social behavior does not reduce to the behavior of a gene. You can't get it by... Look at humans. We know that there are genes for physiological diseases, like there's a gene for Tay-Sachs disease. There's a gene BR for certain forms of breast cancer. But is there a gene for intelligence? No, there's thousands of genes that contribute. Is there a gene for obesity? No, if there were, we'd hit it. We can't affect human behavior very, very effectively chemically. We do a little bit with neurotransmitters, etc. But the fact is, it's the total organization of millions of genes and hundreds of trillions of synapses that create the consciousness that underlies human behavior. And you don't get it by studying single genes. It doesn't work out well that way. You have to operate on a higher level. Now, I'm not suggesting you don't study genes. Of course you should. And there may be great breakthroughs in the future that, solve some of the problems I'm lamenting don't have solutions today. But the idea that you're going to look at single genes or additive genes, by additive I mean genes that don't interact with each other, they just contribute individually to the separately to the organism's fitness. You get nowhere with that. You would not believe, if you look at the intricate mathematics of gene interactions with 2 or 3 or 4 genes, it's just as complex, if not more, than the interactions in quantum mechanics in an atom with 3 or 4 protons. As soon as you get 4 protons, you can't do it anymore. You can't even come close. You use perturbative methods, this and that. You have to operate at a higher level in order to understand human behavior, or animal behavior, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and since we're talking about human cooperation, in terms of social institutions, what would you say is the importance of social institutions in human societies and some of the main functions that they serve? And by the way, is there any other animal species that also has something that even resembles a social institution or not?
Yeah, well, all the social species have social institutions in some sense. Look at a beehive. Right. The queen goes off with a bunch of males, gets inseminated, and they build another hive, and that hive is a social institution. It regulates the relations among the bees. And if you take a gall on a tree with a wasp gall, that's a social institution. It's created socially. And it governs the interactions of the wasps, especially when they're young, before they disperse. So yes, this is pretty universal. But human institutions, there's one thing about humans you have to understand. Mm-hmm. Humans can not just create from their genes institutions, like beavers build dams. They build dams. That's all they do. They can't make hives. They don't evolve the ability to make better dams. They make dams. Humans have evolved the possibility of transforming their social institutions to better serve their needs. This is what we call political theory. The theory of how we change the rules of the game to meet our particular needs. That's political theory. And no other animal has a political theory, because every other animal has a standard way of creating its social structure. And it doesn't change over time, and it can't change it over time. You can't have a bunch of wolves get together and sit down and say, well, listen, we're going to have to behave a little differently. We're going to elect somebody and this and that. Only humans. So, yeah, social institutions and social norms are what make humans the way they are. The flexibility of them is the important thing. Chimpanzees have social institutions, but they're very inflexible. They can't change them to meet their needs. And they can't play games. Interesting. Animals play games, but they only play games that are inscribed in their genome. They can't learn new games. You can't teach an animal a game. They don't understand it. They can't deal with it. You can take 4-year-olds and teach them a game, humans. And say, look, here, you can move this way, and then this is what you do to win. And they learn it fast. And if you make a mistake, they say, you did that wrong. With other animals, you can't even have them play games because they don't understand. There's no way to transmit the idea that there are rules. This is a real problem with applying game theory to animals. You can't really do it because you can't teach them the rules. There's no way to teach an animal the rules. So at any rate, yes, social institutions are very important, and the most important thing is that they're flexible. People change them to meet their needs. And sometimes they make bad mistakes and they go extinct as a society. But the really good changes live on and prosper, reproduce. That's why we talk about cultural evolution. The rules of cultural evolution are a lot like the rules of genetic evolution. They're just evolutionary theory. I go through that in my book, but there's plenty of others who've talked about that too. Mm-hmm. Okay. You can't understand human society without the notion of a social norm. And people know what social norms are. And they don't have to agree with them. Very often people will say, well, this is the norm, but I don't agree with it. I think it's stupid. You can have a society where everybody thinks a social norm is stupid. It's still the norm. So it's different from just saying that it's what I agree with. It's a very sui generis idea, that of a social norm.
Mm-hmm. And because social institutions in human societies allow for us to really learn the rules of the game, let's say, is it the case that social institutions are one of the ingredients, at least, that human societies have that contribute to us being able to expand our moral circle and include more people, even people with whom we don't really know at a personal level, but nonetheless still interact in positive ways?
Yes. This is what Durkheim, the sociologist, taught us many years ago. Absolutely. There's this notion in game theory of common knowledge. Right. Something is of common knowledge if not just everybody knows it, but everybody knows that everybody knows it. And everybody knows that everybody knows that everybody knows it. And that's produced through social institutions. That's why we have to have things like judges and juries and investigative committees that give reports, because the report comes out, and then everybody knows that the report came out, and everybody knows everybody else knows the report came out. And it tends to lead to more harmonious interactions, because people not only believe the same thing, but they know that other people believe it also. And that's a central part of game theory, to understand that. Yeah, definitely social institutions do that. They also impose conformity. Mm-hmm. Social institutions just do it this way, don't do it that way. And people have to behave according to that. And if they don't, you don't even need a court of law. Strong reciprocity. If you violate a social norm, people will yell at you. They will try to hurt you. I've seen it so many times, hundreds of times. You've seen it too. We all have. Right. So yes, the social institutions interact synergistically with our predispositions, our genetic predispositions as a species.
Mm-hmm. But in that sense, things like, for example, group identity are really crucial ingredients here, right? Because, I mean, I have to know that another person is part of the group of people that share the same norms as I do to be able to cooperate properly with them.
Absolutely. In my last book, I call this, that it's distributed cognition. Mm-hmm. Our minds are networked with other minds that we consider to be part of our network, and our cognition is distributed over that network. So it's really wrong to even talk about individual beliefs. It's because individuals are so networked and entangled with others that it doesn't make. For instance, someone will say, "Well, he's very self-interested. He votes all the time for what's good for his group." And I say, well, that's not self-interested. If you're really self-interested, you'll never vote, because one vote never makes a difference, ever. In 200 years in the United States, Canada, 10, 12 different countries all put together, no election has ever, with more than 40,000 voters, has ever been decided by a single person. So no voter has ever mattered at all. But we identify with groups, and you can say someone is self-interested if they vote what their group wants. But that's not what self-interest means. Self-interest means you're out for yourself, in which case you will never vote. So at any rate, humans are so enmeshed, entangled with others, that they don't even realize it. The only way we realize how entangled we are is by looking at theories that say we're not entangled, like traditional economic theory, in which individuals have what are called subjective priors. How do they relate to other people's subjective priors? They don't. They're all separate. It's just yours. And such a person, if rational, which people are, by the way, I make a point of saying this idea that people are irrational is ridiculous. People are rational, but they identify with groups. So they act as representatives of groups when they do things like vote. And this is particularly human. There's no other animal that has a political structure. None.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say is the highest level to which we can push our group identities? Because, I mean, we usually talk about nations or countries and national identities, and then we can even divide, or there are people that divide the world into the Western world and the Eastern world and other divisions like that. But then, even in the same country, there are different subgroups of people and people who are part of different political parties and religions and things like that. So what is really the highest level to which humans can push their group identity and cooperate effectively with other people?
Well, these are very difficult issues. Now, I mean, I can't answer that. What's happened is, if you look over time for the human race, like from the past 100,000 years,
right,
humans have become more mobile. They move around more, and distances don't mean as much. It's not costly. Look at the way we're talking right now. I mean, we're thousands of miles apart, and we do it all the time. People get closer together throughout history. If they interact more, they develop institutions that allow them to live with those interactions. But a lot of it is that you have states that have control the means of coercion, and those states interact with each other and create rules that do or do not serve the whole community. And that's the way it is now. What's what we're going through in the world, say, with climate change. And we went through it with nuclear weapons and still do have problems with this. So you're never going to have people identifying with the nation, the whole world, all humans, unless there were aliens that came in and started threatening us. The only reason all Americans identify as being American is when somebody's pointing a bomb at them, the Russians or the North Koreans or what have you. It's very natural to unite around common purposes against a common enemy. And a common enemy is climate change. So I think we will have uniting around common enemies like climate change, and also viruses like Ebola and the flu virus, which can kill millions. Countries will unite around those things, and they are doing that right now. But, you know, as you probably know, a lot of people who study cosmology believe that there may not be any other intelligent species out there, because once you get intelligent enough, you kill yourself. There's no way to control that. I don't believe that. But you have to understand that humans are moral beings, and as long as they agree that there is a moral threat, they will sacrifice to meet the common need. That's what humans have done forever. Humans are both incredibly cooperative and incredibly competitive at the same time. And you have to always recognize that. You can never just work on one of them, because they absolutely work together to make humans what they are.
Mm-hmm. And let me just ask you this, because during the interview you used several times the word rational, and even said in the last question that you think that humans are rational, and I want to ask you what you really mean by that, because I guess that there are people from other disciplines, let's say from, for example, social psychology and cognitive psychology, who even talk about system 1 and system 2 and tend to associate human rationality with the more deliberative systems, let's say. But when you use the word rational, do you mean that people are rational in the sense that they have all the tools at their disposal to really effectively move in their social environments and establish social relationships?
Yes, this is a very good question. Mm-hmm. And it's a very difficult question, and I've dealt with this in every one of the books you talked about at length. Mm-hmm. Including Individuality and Entanglement. Okay. The kind of the reason I think it's so important is this: disciplines that model behavior in terms of rational choice have very strong theoretical bases. That's economics, and that's population biology, or Darwinian biology. Animals are rational in the sense that they maximize fitness. That's all you need. And then you can use all the tools of rational decision theory to investigate how animals behave, as long as they're maximizing something, in this case fitness. Economics has a very strong base, and it's because it has a notion of choice based on rational behavior. Disciplines like sociology are a mess, and social psychology. Yeah, I don't know if you've talked to people in social psychology. Social psychology is a disaster area. They don't have any basic principles, and there's huge amounts of fraud and complicity in faking data or misinterpreting data. And in sociology, oh my gosh, it's such a mess. It has no theory at all. It's mostly liberal bleeding hearts that support, all sorts of crazy left-wing theories. It's no theory at all. Why? It doesn't. Every discipline that rejects the rational actor model has no core theory. That's all there is to it. But what is the core theory of rationality? It's complicated. It's mathematical. Okay? Mm-hmm. Decision theory started with von Neumann and Morgenstern and Leonard Savage, and it's a very well-developed mathematical theory that explains behavior. But what is the important thing? It's what I call formal rationality. It merely means people have transitive preferences. If you prefer A to B, and you prefer B to C, then you prefer A to C. You can add a few things to that to get Bayes' rule and updating probabilities and stuff, but very little. What it does not say is that rational does not mean you do what's good for you. Not at all. I mean, gosh, people smoke. They hurt themselves all over the place, but you can still say they have transitive preferences and they're rational. It does not mean you do what's good for you. For instance, voting, as I said, your vote doesn't matter at all. One vote just does not matter. You're wasting your time going to the voting place, losing work, blah, blah, and it's not going to help you at all. But you can still be rational. You value contributing to the group, and you have transitive preferences over political behaviors. So when I say rational, I mean that people behave according to the precepts of decision theory. That's all. Not that they are instrumentally rational. Instrumental rationality means you do what maximizes the chances of your achieving a goal. Mm-hmm. Problem is, most things you do, you don't have single goals. If I'm in the subway and someone faints, what's my single goal? I want to go home. I don't want to dirty my gloves. I want to help the guy. I don't want to be subject to a scam. You don't have any one goal, but you can still have transitive preferences. So at any rate, it is a technical issue, but the people who run around and say humans are irrational are just stupid. That's like saying that you can do experiments. Look, Danny Kahneman is a friend of mine, and I think his work is magnificent. It's very, very important. But he doesn't mostly say things like people are irrational. He says people have heuristics, and they mostly work in your favor. But we can do experiments to show that sometimes it doesn't work in your favor. But this is like, suppose you have vision theorists, and you know optical illusions. You've seen a dozen of them, right? After you know it's an optical illusion, you still believe it. It still looks the same. It looks like the shade is darker or lighter or something. But because people suffer from optical illusions doesn't mean we don't see right. Vision theorists don't go around saying, "Oh, humans can't see," because look, we can show you that they screw this up. It's the same thing with these experiments. Yes, they show you very deep things about human behavior, but they don't tell you that people are irrational. They just don't say anything like that at all. They say that people have very sophisticated, complicated tastes. And, I could give you a dozen examples, if you were interested. But in general, the idea of going around saying humans are irrational is it's as silly as saying, I don't know, bees don't make honey. What do you think bees make? What do you think they're good for? What do you think humans are good for? We're more rational than any other species in some sense. I'm not at all sympathetic to this people who are irrational stuff. And also the self-help books that come from it. People who say, oh, if you learn your own decision-making weaknesses, you'll make better decisions. Well, maybe you will. I'm not sure you won't. I don't know. But most of the decisions people make are decisions they want to make. Yeah, people are much more likely to have poor beliefs, right? Mm-hmm. People have beliefs and they can't justify them, and if they behave according to their beliefs, these are not their preferences, they're beliefs. And I don't have a theory of the rationality of beliefs. I think humans it's very complex, human beliefs. And much more shoddy and difficult to understand than human preferences. When I go to the supermarket, I know how people are going to behave pretty well. But about beliefs, well, I don't know.
And when you talk about beliefs here, are you referring to things like for example, folk science, what some people call folk science, that is the way we are innately predisposed to look at the world and things like that?
Right. That among other things. For instance, the law of small numbers. Then people don't believe probability theory. They think people go on streaks, or if your roulette wheel hasn't turned up a number 17 for a long time, you're more likely to get a 17. Bad beliefs about the nature of probability. Oh no, sure. But there are others, which are some beliefs. It doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. It doesn't affect your life, so believe whatever you please. Look at all the people who believe in creationism or intelligent design, and they don't believe that humans evolved from a predecessor primate species. Well, what's the difference? If you're in most people's lives, it could matter less what they believe about. They can believe whatever they please. If you want to believe God is purple and has a great big long beard, big deal. Now, the problem comes when someone says, God is purple and has a long beard, and he told me that you should give me your money. And people line up and it's like, take the money. So when I say I don't understand beliefs, I mean stuff like that. I personally am a scientist. Mm-hmm. I can't think of anything I really believe in that I would defend believing in that doesn't have some factual basis. But people do all the time. So it's a very, very complex issue about beliefs, and it's certainly I would not say people are dispassionate scientific observers in their social beliefs. Not at all. Not at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Gintis, just one last question. When people ask, what is human nature, do you think that question makes sense? And if so, what would be your answer?
Yes, well, look, is there duck nature? Yeah. Let's say here's a certain kind of duck. How does it behave? Well, it's got feathers like this, and it eats that, and if you step on it, it dies, and all sorts of things. It's duck nature. Is that different from rhinoceros nature? Yeah. The rhinoceros are different from ducks. Humans are different from other species. They have a lot of commonality in the way they differ from other species, and that commonality is what I call human nature. There was a wonderful book, Brown's book, on commonalities in societies all across the world.
The book you're referring to is one called Human Universals, right?
That's right, yes. Mm-hmm. But here's another thing. I can go to some, I mean, I've done it. I've gone to Africa to a small village where there's no electricity and lived there, and I totally understand how everybody behaves in that society. It takes a little bit of time, but mostly they behave the same way I behave. They love, they hate, they're petty, they're cooperative, they sing, they dance, they make love. They do it. You can learn another society in no time at all. Now, we tend to stress big differences in morality. For instance, patriarchal societies versus gender equality, and these are very important, rules of the game that are different across society. But mostly, we have a common core of humanity, and it's inscribed in our genome. We're genetically predisposed to have this, and societies that try to control that have difficulty. Dictators would love it if we were empty and we didn't have any natures. But people are not like that. People protect their kids, and people care about fairness everywhere in the world. They care about fairness. You can't have a dictator who says, well, fairness is gone. There's no such thing. We just have big men, and they tell everybody what to do, so live with it. You can try to do that, but it doesn't work. You also have to have a lot of soldiers. And then that doesn't even work, because the soldiers turn on you. So at any rate, yes, of course there's human nature. It's not, the human nature is like a book nature. There's lots of different books, or soup nature. There's something called soup. There's 1,000 kinds of soup. It has this common core, somehow or other, or almost a common core. So anyway, I have no problem with that. The people who say there's no such thing as human nature are the tabula rasa people who say that, well, we can teach people to behave any way at all. It's purely random. Whatever you teach them to behave, that's how they're going to behave. And if you deny that, then you believe there's human nature. There's certain things you can't teach. You can't teach people to hate their children. Right. You can't teach people to love being subordinated. You can reward them for being subordinated, and then they'll take it. Like all of President Trump's toady cabinet, they go around saying how wonderful it is to be working for the big president. But they get paid off pretty well to do that, and then after a few months they start leaking to the press how horrible everything really is, etc. Human beings have a nature. And when I meet a new human being, unless they're mentally ill or something, we belong. Because we have a common nature, and we have common ways of communicating, etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Gintis, let's end the interview here. And again, I would really like to thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. And as I said, I will be leaving links in the description box of the interview for all of your work, for people to go and check it out, because I think it's very interesting. And I don't know, perhaps somewhere in the future we could do another conversation. So.
Okay, thanks a lot. Nice talking to you.
Okay, so...
You're a new human being, unless they're mentally ill or something, we belong. Because we have a common nature, and we have common ways of communicating, etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Gintis, let's end the interview here. And again, I would really like to thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. And as I said, I will be leaving links in the description box of the interview for all of your work, for people to go and check it out, because I think it's very interesting. And I don't know, perhaps somewhere in the future we could do another conversation. So.
Okay, thanks a lot. Nice talking to you.
Okay, so hi everybody, thank you so much for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Otherwise, if you don't like Patreon, you can also go to PayPal or Subscribestar. All of the links are in the description box of the video and also on my channel. And apart from that, you can also, of course, leave a like, share the interview and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Per Helga Larsen, Ló Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, and my first producer, Isar Webe. Thank you for all.